James Rosen, it is a pleasure to have you on the program. You and I have sat for hours and talked about the Beatles, and I know that you have, it's really an encyclopedic knowledge of all things having to do with the Beatles. So let me start with that question. Why do you think the Beatles did their first performance in America in the nation's capital?
It had to be the gutters and the roofing.
There it is. Good night, everybody.
All right, we're done. Drop the microphone, walk away.
I hope we pass the audition. Well, I think it was probably Brian Epstein's decision, not the Beatles' decision, where their first concert would be. When they played the D.C. Coliseum on February 11, 1964, impossibly 50 years ago today, it was the largest crowd the Beatles had ever played. 8,000,
really?
Yeah, at that point, 8,092 paying customers. And it was the first time, and it turned out to be the last time, that the Beatles played in the round, which means they were put in basically on a boxing ring, and that crowd of 8,000 was surrounding them on all sides. They'd never done that before, and it created a logistical problem for them, which if you watch the old films of the concert, you can see that every few songs, as a gesture to the audience, they didn't want anyone to be spending the entire concert watching them from behind or what have you. They would actually shift their instruments 45 degrees, and so everyone got to see them frontally for a little bit. That never happened again.
Yeah, but they didn't have any roadies. I've seen this footage, and it's like Ringo is spinning his own little drum kit there on this turntable.
They
it's
had
hilarious.
They had one or two guys who stayed with them loyally, but yeah, it was awkward.
Yeah.
One of the things that we've sort of figured out in talking to a lot of people about this was that this didn't happen in a vacuum. I mean, clearly the Beatles were not huge here just before they came, but there were a lot of people working behind the scenes to make sure the records got played. And in fact, on WWDC, they were played for the very first time in America.
Carol James,
and we had a little clip from Carol James talking about that. But I mean, by the time they got here, they had become a thing. I mean, really, today we would say they went viral, but this was well before social media.
Right. The Beatles refused to come to America until they had a #1 hit single here, which was rather audacious, but they had seen other British rock and roll acts try to make it big in America and fail. And they determined that wasn't going to happen to them. I Want to Hold Your Hand went to #1 in January of 1964 while the Beatles were in Paris. There are photographs of them learning at the exact moment your record is #1 in America and them jumping for joy. And then they came here. And there was something of a kind of a publicity campaign that Capitol Records launched on their behalf in the weeks leading up to the Ed Sullivan Show and their arrival here. And it was very successful. The timing was right, obviously, just a couple of months or a few months after the assassination of President Kennedy. The United States was looking for something to lift it out of its grief, if you will. But, of course, really, had the Beatles come here 6 months earlier or 6 months later, I think the impact would have been the same because of the music and their personalities.
James Rosen, Fox News Channel, is live in studio with us, and by the way, he'll be with us through the whole half hour, so we can sort of settle into this and talk about the Beatles, writ large. We're focusing.
Does that mean, is that code for get high with a lava lamp? What is that, Larry? What does that mean?
Oh yeah, psychedelics will be happening in the third segment.
No, they won't. I promise.
Well, but let's continue here on the early Beatles and where they had just got. You said they were in Paris when they learned of this. Do you buy into the idea in the Outliers? Malcolm Gladwell spoke about this, where they became the Beatles. They really unified as a unit with those thousands and thousands of hours performing in Hamburg, Germany. Do you agree with that? Do you think that that's what really made this cohesive unit so perfect?
That is absolutely correct. However, we should not infer from what Malcolm Gladwell wrote that any bunch of guys who would spend 10,000 hours practicing together would become the Beatles.
Yeah.
There is no question that by the time they returned from their first one or two visits to Hamburg, probably the Beatles were, as the historian Mark Lewison has noted, the most experienced rock and roll group the world over. It can't be known for sure, but it is believed that no one had spent as much time playing rock and roll music as the Beatles had by that point.
They were doing like 12-hour days there in Hamburg. People think they just did like a gig a night. It was a whole day long.
It was a 7-hour set.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and so it forced them to expand their repertoire and get good.
Yeah, and so they said, we're a great little band.
Well,
you hear Paul McCartney still say that even now, because they got to the point where they could play virtually anything.
One of the things about being Paul McCartney, I mean, Paul McCartney has lived a singular human existence. No one has been quite so famous, with the possible exception of the Queen Mum, or the Queen Mother, for as long as Paul McCartney has. Garth Brooks once said that nobody has had as much projected onto them as human beings as the Beatles did, and that's a heavy weight to carry.
Yeah.
for so long. As a consequence of that, almost as a kind of very understandable defense mechanism, Paul, in interview after interview, kind of just has settled on a few things he says, like a jukebox almost. And almost no matter, if you don't know what you're doing as an interviewer, you're going to get a 6. The great thing about John and I was that, we'd record music, and then we'd sell it. And it's like, sort of reductio ad absurdum, but you have to know what you're doing.
Yeah, and so if you've had the opportunity to talk, you actually, we're going to get to this later, performed with Sir Paul.
Yes.
We'll have to have that story.
Yeah,
for
I'm
sure.
going to riff for 35, 40 minutes, and you just follow along on that, Brian.
Yeah. But I mean, what would be the most? What is the question that you think is out there that has not yet been asked that you'd like to get to the bottom of?
Well, when I did interview Paul, I did not really ask him the things I've always wanted to ask Paul, because I have a book project I've been working on, and I tailored the interview narrowly to help me advance that narrative, which was a rare act of discipline on my part. But there are other questions I would like to ask that might be of a more personal nature. Involving the relationships of the Beatles and their spouses and so forth in the 60s that I think would be of interest. The question is raised, is there any part of the Beatles' lives that should remain private? And that's a fair question.
All right. As America evolved in the 60s, the Beatles evolved too. We're going to take that next step with James Rosen live in studio here as our commemoration continues.
It's 8:15 now. WMAL traffic and weather every 10 minutes. First on the 5s. Here is Liz Drabeck.
And it's a mess right now this morning. New collision on the Adelupe at Pennsylvania Avenue. You have just a couple lanes getting you through, so everybody bunching up on the approach. Your types begin coming in from Branch Avenue to the collision. Actually, looks like now just one lone right lane is blocked, so some improvement has been made. Eastbound 66, the car rest area, the accident gone. You're tied up on the approach in from the Prince William Parkway, 95 north. You are crawling into Dale City, where you will find just one left lane and one right lane getting you through the accident activity. Speeds stay down from that point all the way into the crash on the shoulder at the Fairfax County Parkway, but you're not done yet. Delays keep you sluggish all the way up towards the Capitol Beltway. Now, the 105.9 FM at AM 630 WMAL Weather Channel forecast.
Winter storm watch for tomorrow evening through Thursday evening. Look, it's going to be cold today and clear and cold tonight, and tomorrow it's going to be partly cloudy. But tomorrow night, snow showers in the evening, steady and heavy snow likely after midnight. Some sleet may mix in late, and then they say accumulations could be 4 to 6 inches and more snow on Thursday with highs in the mid-30s. Currently in the nation's capital, it is 22 degrees. It is now 8:17 on WMAL.
It won't be long, yeah, yeah, yeah. It won't be long, yeah, yeah. It won't be long.
Very pleased to be joined here in studio by one of my dear friends and a man who knows more about the Beatles than the law allows. James Rosen, senior Washington correspondent for the Fox News Channel, and a man who has just immersed much of his personal life in learning everything there is to be learned about the Beatles. You mentioned that you've got a project you're working on.
Yeah, I've spent, I've been obsessed my whole life. Let's be clear here. I'm an obsessional character.
I think that goes without
but
saying.
not a dangerous one. My son.
It's really interesting. Nixon and the Beatles are your big obsession.
It's the counterculture era, I think. But my two sons, their actual middle names are Lennon and McCartney, which is evidence of my neurosis and my wife's patience. And I since the mid-1980s, I've been assiduously collecting every sonic blip you can get your hands on. I don't care about lunchboxes and things like that, but every scratchy demo, every studio rehearsal outtake for every single song, and for the solo ex-Beatles as well. But only in the last 5 years or so have I actually begun work on an actual book project about them. It's more or less a biography of a single song, which is a framework that will enable me to sort of look at them at a particular period, which is the moment they stopped touring and jettisoned Beatlemania and began to find themselves awash in psychedelic drugs, having problems in their marriages and so forth, and creating their masterpiece, which is the Sgt. Pepper album.
Let's talk about that journey for a minute, because, the 60s were the Beatles. You look at what the Beatles went through in the 60s, where they started like this, not clean cut. They had the mop tops, but they were wearing their suits on Ed Sullivan. And then they ended with, hair down to the middle of their back and lots of drug influences. Did the Beatles help influence the 60s and the changes in society and culture through that decade, or did they reflect the changes that were going on?
there's a lot of hyperbole about that, and I subscribe personally to all of it.
A safe place.
Timothy Leary, the LSD guru, said that the Beatles were avatars sent by God to be the prototypes of a new evolutionary species of man, a race of laughing young free men. And I believe that personally.
Well, what's scary, by the way, is that was the one time he was sober when he said that, which is shocking.
Like the broken clock that's right every once in a while. But the Beatles always themselves dispelled that kind of mythology and simply said, we were spokesmen of a sort. And Paul has always said, in terms of music, we were the greatest criminals going. John and I nicked everything from everybody. And he was fond of quoting Pablo Picasso, who used to say, mediocrity borrows, genius steals.
Ooh, I like that, and we'll use it on a daily basis in my radio career.
All right, so I want you to set up, and we'll get back to the story. We'll just set it before the commercial break. You got to play with Sir Paul.
Right.
Now, just set the scene of where it happened.
Washington, D.C., October 8, 2005. An 8-1 underdog named James Rosen attends a taping at XM Artist Confidential Studios.
He's over at the XM Studios here in D.C.
That's right.
And he's doing a taping, and you somehow, because I was there, you wheedled tickets to this event.
Right. Friends of a friend. It was a very exclusive thing, 47 chairs in a studio with a baby grand and an acoustic guitar and Sir Paul McCartney.
And there comes a moment where Paul turns and asks for volunteers from the audience, and James is going to pick up the story right there in just a moment. James, we set the stage. You're at the XM Studios. Paul McCartney has a new album out. He's playing some numbers from it, and he turns to the audience and says he wants some volunteers for the audience.
Anybody feel like volunteering?
And of course, you immediately ran over 3 old ladies and 2 children to get to the front of the stage.
They're still cleaning up the blood.
But pick up the story from there. What happened?
So this is a very exclusive crowd. There's only 47 chairs in this very small studio, and I pulled string after string to get myself and my wife into this event. It was a taping of XM Artist Confidential, sort of like what used to be Unplugged, if you will. And at some point, Paul straps on the acoustic and he says, for this next number, I could use some volunteers. So I shoot up both hands, and he goes, okay, you. I was in the second row. We arrived like 2 hours early for this thing. So neurotic. And because I was really pretty close to him, and then, okay, and you, and these other 2 people from the back. And I get up there. I'm the first one up there. My wife whispers to me something that's unsayable on the radio, which is, please keep your blankety blank together. You cannot weep on this man. Because our second date back in 2002 when Paul played, I guess, he was at Washington. I'm trying to remember the venue, maybe RFK. And she had seen me weeping uncontrollably for 10 minutes. And so I got to play. I shook his hand. I said, union wages, right? And he goes, no, you're not going to get paid for this. And he goes, don't get above your station. And he put me at the twinkly end of the keys, and he literally took my hand and directed me what to play, and then told us, softer, which if you listen to take 1 of I Want to Hold Your Hand on the anthology album, dun 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 dun, Ringo, softer, Ringo.
Oh, wow.
And so, anyway, I have the audio, and I have a photograph of it.
And it was, is that like the greatest moment in your life?
It's
short of the birth of your children, the marriage of your wife.
# pinnacle.
Yeah, it's right there.
Thanks for throwing him a lifeline on that, though, because
I've saved your butt there.
So what have we learned here? We learned that James Rosen is an absolute Beatles nut and knows everything there is to know about them, and we've learned that Mrs. James Rosen is an absolute saint.
Yes, she
for
is.
putting up with them.
You have no idea.
All right, well, listen, this is what happens sometimes when we've got someone like James Rosen in studio. It's just too good to stop. So James is going to stay with us and in through the next hour, and this is a good time for you to jump in. Do you have questions about the Beatles you want to ask the expert, James Rosen? Give us a call. Joining us live in studio, Fox News Channel senior reporter, and also, more importantly today, Beatles expert and big fanboy, James Rosen. James, thanks for joining us again.
Thank you very much.
I wanted to ask you, just again, in terms of the journey of the Beatles and what kind of influence they had on society, you look at their albums, and there's this little window there, I think it's like 18 months, where they did Rubber Soul, Revolver, and Sgt. Pepper's in just that short amount of time.
Incredibly fertile period. But, of course, they were not in isolation. They were listening to what was also going on, and one of the groups that they most admired in terms of sonic experimentation at that time was the Beach Boys, and you had Mike Love on in a previous segment, and when Pet Sounds came out in 1966, Paul McCartney was just awed by it, and he said, we've got to do something that's as good as this. And then they released Sgt. Pepper, and by some accounts that drove Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys
mad
and into a sandbox in his house for several years.
Do you
Unbelievable.
believe that story?
I do. I've read about it. He's done interviews.
All right, so we've asked the people who listen to our program, our loyal listeners, if they have a question for you. So you ready to take some questions from the masses?
This is like, please, Mr. Postman.
That's
Let's do it. All right.
Let's go to Jason in Alexandria. You're on with Brian and Larry. What do you think?
Hey, guys, love your show. And James, like the Justice Department, I watch you all the time on
Oh,
That's very good.
Do you have a question then, lad?
Yes, I do. I want to really test his knowledge. He sounds like an incredible expert.
He is.
But what group did the Beatles take under their wings in the late 60s thinking they'd be the successor supergroup?
Badfinger.
That's right.
Bingo.
Yeah. No, did you have a good question? Come on,
Oh,
Ray. What do you got here?
talking
What was
trash,
that?
see?
Right. This is the New Yorker in me coming out.
thanks, Jason. That inspires a question for me, though. They're doing a big celebration tonight, and I think Beatlemania will be there. They were all the rage. There was a Beatle sort of
Impersonator group.
group, and Cheap Trick actually, who actually I believe they were influenced directly with Paul McCartney. Weren't they in the 70s?
Well,
they do Sgt. Pepper's as a concert.
Cheap Trick actually recorded with John Lennon on his final album and recorded the entire album as his backup band. And from what they told me, Yoko objected and they redid the sessions with other session musicians. Yeah.
Well, my question of the covers and tribute groups, so who do you think really best captures that magic?
At the British Embassy this past Friday night here in Washington, they had a Beatles tribute. They were kind enough to invite me in deference to my obsessional neurosis. And they had the group 1964. And as I was telling everyone that night, 3 drinks, squint, and it's them.
It's
All
them,
right.
right.
We'll look them up.
Is the bass player, does he play left-handed?
He does. I mean, every last little, even the George Harrison guy, while the others are singing, sort of goes over and checks on things on his amp. Just they have every mannerism down.
Dave in Silver Spring, you're on with Brian, Larry, and James Rosen.
Hey, good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
Thanks for having me.
What do you think? What's your question?
Well, it's 2 questions. I know it's not necessarily a Ginger or Mary Ann, but is James also a fan of the Stones?
Oh yeah, the Stones and the Beatles were always great friends and contemporaries. The Beatles actually gave the Stones one of their early singles. They finished writing "I Want to Be Your Man" right in front of them and gave it to them.
Yeah.
And if you watch interviews with Keith Richards, it wasn't like some competition. It was more like a corroboration. And that.
All right, Sylvie.
You may have picked up that James is an excellent mimic.
Sylvie and Waldorf. By the way, Sylvie is to Brian and Larry what James is to the Beatles.
That's right.
Sylvie and Waldorf,
All
you're
right,
on
Sylvie.
WMAL.
James, what really happened to Pete Best? Why was he let go so early in the band's career?
Well, it wasn't really that early. He was a Beatle for 2 years. He was the original drummer for the Beatles. They got him because they needed to leave the next day for a tour of Scotland where they'd be backing up another musician named Johnny Gentle. He wasn't really that good a drummer, and every recording session they had before they finally landed their final recording contract, the producers actually wouldn't let him play. They'd take away parts of his drum kit.
Really? Now, I've heard you say this before, that you think Ringo is really an underestimated drummer. A lot of people say Ringo's not that good, but you disagree.
Not only I disagree, but if you ask virtually any professional drummer and any big-time drummer, they will tell you Ringo was a genius. He was a revolutionary musical
In what
genius.
way?
Well, this is a little embarrassing, but I'm going to do it anyway. A lot of music, rock music, before the Beatles came along was based on old jazz swing. Gonna tell Aunt Mary about Uncle John. And it sort of swung like this. And a lot of Motown music, and the Beatles loved and adored Motown, was on the one beat. Uptight. Everything is out of sight. Sugar pie, honey bunch. What Ringo introduced to and this is not enough people focus on this, was real backbeat. It was, it's been a hard day's night. Boom, boom, bop, boom, boom. Much more muscular beat, and it drove girls crazy.
You are the 5th Beatle, James Rosen. Let's go to Jim and Bowie. Jim, you're on WMAL.
Hi, Jim Rosen. This is Jim Murphy and Bowie.
Hey.
I'm a big fan of yours
Thank
on
you.
Fox.
Thanks, man.
And quick question, no trick question here, just your personal favorite. If you were on a desert island, would it be Pet Sounds or Sgt. Pepper?
Ooh.
That's a tough call.
That is not a tough call, actually.
For you.
But,
Would
whenever...
it be a hard call for me?
Whenever anyone says, what's your favorite Beatles song, what's your favorite Beatle album, who's your favorite Beatle, I always answer the same way. To a hardcore, delusional, obsessional Beatles freak, that's like asking, which of my children would I save from a burning building? It's heretical. It's offensive. And I won't answer.
How dare you, sir?
No, come on. Seriously, you have a favorite.
A favorite what?
Album.
No, I really...
You adore them all.
How could one choose between With the Beatles and Revolver or the White Album?
Or Beatles for Sale.
If I had to choose one on a desert island, I'd have to choose the White Album because it's their only double album and you get the most Beatle buck for your Beatle bang.
Yeah, there it is.
It's the bloody
James,
White Album.
Let me ask you this. You know, it's in the news right now, so much talk about legalization of marijuana. State of Washington, state of Colorado has done it. We just mentioned what a prolific period that was there. Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, of course, into the White Album. Marijuana was a big part of their lives at that time. Do you think that their creativity was actually stifled by their pot use or enhanced or no difference?
Well, I wouldn't want anyone to accept this as an endorsement of any particular activity, but there's no question that drugs enhanced the Beatles' artistry. But the Beatles were very responsible about this. George Harrison was the only Beatle to show up at Haight-Ashbury in the Summer of Love, and he was high on acid with his wife, and a huge crowd started following him, and the vibes turned bad, and he saw people begging on the streets and sort of drug addicts laying there, and he was disgusted by it, and he came out and he did well-publicized interviews at that time saying, if you're really hip, you don't need things like LSD. And remember the message from Hey Jude. This was actually in my high school yearbook photo. The movement you need is on your shoulder.
All right.
On that very deep note.
James, it's a real pleasure to have you in studio. Please come back sometime.
I will.
It's